This is Mac Payne here with episode 1832 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In the previous 5 episodes, I have talked about Air America. I had some connections with Air America while I was flying Cobra gunships in the 101st Airborne Division over in Vietnam. I had a fascination with that organization that's lasted to this very day. Recently, I found out something about them that is causing me concern. They need some help, and that's what I've been trying to do. In the previous 5 episodes, I shared some information from Alan Cates' tremendous book about Air America. We started off describing about how it got started. It was inspired by none other than General Claire Chennault, the pride of Commerce, Texas. He started an organization in China back before we got into World War II, and that evolved into what we knew back in the Vietnam War as Air America. It was very interesting learning more about it because most people form their opinions about Air America from movies like Air America with Mel Gibson. About 99% of what was in that movie was not correct. I shared with you the real story of it, and everyone who is aware of that story should have a very high regard for Air America because they did a lot of good things for our country back then. And those people who served in Air America should be highly regarded for it. But guess what? Because the government sometimes weaves webs of deception and they don't like to admit what they're doing, Air America personnel got caught up in the meat grinder. And now they're hurting for something they need, federal pension benefits, and they've been denied them because of all these untrue things that have been said about them. So now here we are. You now know about Air America. I'm calling on everybody to help us correct this wrong that has been done to them. And in this episode, I have a very, very special guest who is going to tell us all about the situation and what we can do to help out. She is none other than Maureen Ebersole. She's a high-up lawyer that is helping Air America take care of the situation. And she has been doing this for 10 years, so she knows what she's doing. Not only that, she's following in the footsteps of her father, who was also the chief counsel to Air America. So she knows this from the beginning to the end, and that's why I am so excited for her to be here. Maureen, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Max. Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's an honor.
Well, you are very welcome. I would like to get right down to the nitty-gritty of the question here, and this is about the situation with Air America. I have a few questions here I'd like to ask, and I'm sure with your knowledge of the situation, you can help us out. So let's get started with this one. I have seen numerous articles in the press recently about Air America and Congress. What is all this about?
Okay, we are working to get legislation passed to recognize the former employees of Air America as having been U.S. government employees entitled to federal retirement credit for their work between 1950 and 1976. They were recognized as federal employees under the law at the time they worked, but the top secret nature of Air America prevented them from being put into the federal retirement system. So we're working now on legislation that puts them into that system where they belong.
Go ahead and tell me a little bit more about how you got involved in this effort.
I got involved because my father was vice president and senior legal counsel of Air America. He had some very good lawyers working for him, including one very brilliant man, Bill Merrigan. I've known Mr. Merrigan since I was 7 years old when he worked for my dad, and he was our neighbor in Taipei for about 10 years when they worked together over there. Mr. Merrigan started this whole effort back in Congress in 2003. He connected with Senator Harry Reid and helped some Senate lawyers write up the legislation. He had a lot of experience in working at the House of Representatives years ago when he was a Georgetown law student, so he really knows how Congress works. And he knows so much about Air America. He still has all of his files with documents going back to 1962, and he has an amazing memory. He would not personally benefit from the legislation because he went on to work for the Department of Defense for almost 40 years. He's already maxed out on federal retirement credit. he really just took up this effort to help his Air America colleagues. In 2010, I offered to help him, and then in 2014, my sister Carolyn joined us, and in 2016, my sister Christine. So we're an all-volunteer family team. I'm a lawyer. Carolyn came out of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service to work for Henry Kissinger's consultancy as an East Asia expert. And Christine was in banking and has a great deal of technology expertise that we all need. Anyway, Mr. Merrigan is like family to us, and we know so many of the other Air Americans the legislation would affect. And for us, the legislation really matters because it will provide elderly Air Americans with the retirement payments they earned and deserve, but it will also set their history straight, a lot of U.S. military history. One pilot told us he doesn't want his grandchildren left with a tale of him having been a mercenary or a drug runner. He wants them to know he was a U.S. government employee doing what he believed was right for the country. He wants people to know that his 88 Air America colleagues who were killed in action and those who are still officially listed MIA, and there are several, and they were working honorably for the U.S. government.
Wow, I can see why you're so devoted to it, and you're also very fortunate to have someone like this Mr. Merrigan working with you. I mean, he sounds like a walking encyclopedia.
He is.
The other thing that's wonderful about this is you three sisters are working on this together.
Yes, we are, and we're very passionate about it. We think it's funny that Bill Merrigan, our dad was his boss, and now we call him our boss.
That's something else that's wonderful about this story. You've got this person working on it. Usually it's difficult to get three siblings to come to a Thanksgiving dinner, much less work on something like this. With that in mind, where is this legislation today? I've heard there are signs of progress.
Yes, Senator Rubio and Senator Warner have filed a standalone bill, S-4380, with 14 bipartisan original co-sponsors and another 3 co-sponsors who signed on shortly after the legislation was filed. It's a very commendable bipartisan effort with several committee leaders who are not only from the Intelligence Committee, but also Veterans Affairs, Foreign Relations, and the HELP Committee, which is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So we're now working on building onto our co-sponsorship list. I want to give a shout out to all those who've signed on so far. Thank you, Senators Baldwin, Cardin, Casey, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Feinstein, Hirono, Jones, Klobuchar, Menendez, Murray, Rosen, Rounds, Schumer, Tester, and Warner. It's a really good bipartisan group, and we expect others to join. We, of course, think every senator who supports people who fought for this country should add their name.
I don't know if you realize it. You have accomplished an incredible achievement. I see senators from both parties supporting the same thing, and that is amazing in this day of division in our government. To me, you are really doing something special just with that. Let's hear more. Now, that's in the Senate. Don't you have to have a companion bill in the House to get this passed into law?
Yes, and just last week, Senator Rubio's office advised us that Congressman Glenn Grothman, he's a Republican from Wisconsin's 6th District up near Oshkosh, he's going to file an identical companion bill with a Democratic co-lead in the House. And we had a conference call with him just yesterday, and we started working with his office. Again, we're looking for as many co-sponsors as possible to keep the momentum going.
That is impressive. It sounds good, but I know how it is in the Congress. You've got people that have different ideas. Are there actually still senators and congressmen who don't understand the issue after all these years or who object to the legislation?
Yeah, I'd say there are still some who don't get it, even some on the Intelligence Committee who seem to find it easier to stay with what they think they know from the CIA's old narrative. We find the word contract seems to confuse a lot of people. We so often have to explain that Air Americans were not government contractors like the ones all over Washington today. They were U.S. government employees. They were paid on the government's GS wage scale. Their employer was the U.S. government. There was no other entity responsible for their welfare. People get confused because the government used contracts with Air America as a supposed private entity to hide the government's involvement, and they often refer to Air America as the contractor, while Air Americans refer to the CIA as the customer. It was the U.S. government going through the motions of negotiating contracts with the U.S. government in reality. As Senator Warner's Intelligence Committee staffer said, oh yeah, those were just cover contracts. But many people nowadays don't know what cover contracts are. They know Blackwater and Halliburton and others like that and assume that that's what Air America was. So we still encounter some staffers and even some senators who get lost in the word contract. They're among those who just haven't caught up with new evidence disclosed by declassified documents. For years, we could argue that the CIA narrative wasn't true, but we didn't have the definitive evidence we now have from CIA declassified documents.
What would you say is the main objection to this proposed legislation now?
Well, we've shot down every objection with declassified government documents and with proof that Air America deposited sufficient funds into the Civil Service Retirement Fund to more than cover the cost of the legislation. So mostly what we hear today is the groundless fear that the legislation could set a precedent and open the door to thousands of others who might come out of the woodwork and claim to be like Air Americans. This is, of course, nonsense because congressional legislation is not driven by precedent. That's something that guides the judicial decisions in courts. If Congress were guided by precedent, such a precedent would already exist from legislation passed years ago for other groups of clandestine employees of organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Asia Foundation of yesteryear. So, in fact, Air Americans are the last group of such employees. They're not the trailblazers who might set a precedent. And it ought to be noted that of all these worthy groups, Air Americans were the only ones who were being shot at on the job. As one congressman who sees through the nonsense of the precedent discussion said, well, if there are others out there that the government has shorted, then they can come forward and ask us to consider legislation to pay them too. That's our job. The good news is that we've been told by some offices that once you get to the point where you start hearing primarily the precedent objection, which is apparently not unique to us, you're getting close to the finish line.
Well, that's good to hear that you're getting close. Now, tell me more about these declassified documents and where did you find them? Daniel Ellsberg didn't bring them to you, did he?
No.
Pardon me, that was a joke.
That's funny.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, tell us about.
I like it.
I'm wondering about all these documents. You know how secret things are. How in the world did you get them?
Under an executive order that was first enacted in 1996, we now have a law that requires mandatory declassification of all government documents after 25 years. So for the Vietnam War, mandatory declassification kicked in the year 2000. This doesn't mean we got access to all of the documents in 2000. The CIA dragged its feet under its right to redact certain information. So in the case of Air America, the release of the year 2000 documents didn't really happen until 2009. And those documents focused mainly on Air America operations, not administrative issues like retirement credit. But then in 2017, we got a huge break when a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit pressured the CIA into uploading 13 million pages of declassified documents onto its own website. Many of these, it turns out, were from the administrative side of the CIA and contain information, lots of information about retirement credit. The documents are not easily searched, however. It's not like doing your regular Google search. It's taken us thousands of hours to search through the documents based on our knowledge of Air America and the CIA personnel who were involved in their day in order to find definitive proof that Air America was, in fact, owned by the government and its employees were federal employees entitled to civil service credit. But most importantly, we found that the CIA knew this at the time they were working, that Air Americans were working, and that the position against credit only evolved after Air America was dissolved. And we just kept finding more and more documents and putting them all together and then presenting all this evidence to the Senate Intelligence Committee. And some of the staff really took an interest, and that's how we got where we are today.
You know, I have a question here. You said you had to go through 13 million pages of declassified documents. How many people did you have helping you in this process?
Really, just my sister Carolyn and me.
Just the three of you were going through 13 million pages?
Really, just the two of us. Christine wasn't doing that. I don't think we've been through all 13 million. We're still working on it.
Gosh, I'm just blown away with your devotion to this. Of course, when you know these people, well, you grew up with them, you know it, so that would motivate you to do it. So you've been going through all these millions of declassified documents. What was the point of all the secrecy surrounding Air America that's now been declassified?
That's a good question, and it's not well known today just how important Air America was to the U.S. government and what the secrecy that still jangles people's nerves was all about. The secrecy really centered on the belief that the military and moral authority of the United States lay in its adherence to certain international treaties and the rules of warfare. And during the Vietnam War, this primarily centered on the Geneva Accords, which mandated respect for the neutrality of certain countries, including Laos. Now, the U.S. knew that the North Vietnamese were not respecting the neutrality of Laos, and they were using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to cut down through Laos to infiltrate South Vietnam. But we needed to take the high ground and be the one that adhered to the Geneva Convention. We really saw it as key to maintaining our moral authority in the world and to keeping our allies on board during the Cold War. We couldn't be seen as using our armed forces in Laos, so we used Air America. And we pretended it was a private entity with a few contracts with the Defense Department, and we denied the connection to the CIA.
All those things you were talking about there, like with a plausible deniability of what was going on over there in Vietnam War, used to drive Vietnam veterans crazy because we would see things and we'd say, well, let's go do it. Let's go get them. And no, you can't do that. That's over here. So you can't do that over here, but you, and it would like, after 2 weeks, I saw that the whole thing was just a real county fair, and I didn't let it worry me, but there were guys over there that it really seriously bothered them that says, how can you fight a war? We literally do have one arm tied behind our back. And it's like we were in the Army just looking at it, but these poor guys in Air America, they were wrapped up in the middle of it. Now, speaking of Air America, many times we have heard that Air America was owned by the CIA, that it was the CIA's airline or the CIA's Air Force. How would you describe the connection of Air America to the U.S. government officially?
Well, the characterization of Air America's connection to the U.S. government being primarily a connection to the CIA is not entirely accurate. It's still not widely known that Air America was more than just a CIA airline, or however it's typically described. Nobody talks about just how important Air America was to the very top decision makers in Washington. It was such a key instrument of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War that it was often discussed in the president's daily brief. Secret cables from the State Department about the activities of Air America were shared regularly with U.S. embassies in capitals of major allies in cities all over the world, not only in Asia, in Bangkok, Saigon, and Tokyo, but also in places like London and Ottawa and Brussels. The connection to the State Department and the Department of Defense has always been downplayed. Although many of Air America's missions, especially its search and rescue missions for downed U.S. airmen, which were so critical during the war, were directed by the State Department and carried out by Air America with the Department of Defense. These critical missions usually had nothing to do with the CIA. So on the subject of federal retirement credit, when we talk about retirement credit, it doesn't get more federal than how the U.S. government organized and worked all of these employees together. All the others received either military pensions or federal retirement credit. It's unjustifiable that Air Americans have been excluded, and it's stunning how many hurdles have been put in their way over the years.
I see that as a sorry state of affairs. I hate to see the way it worked out, but getting on to this, did you know that your dad was connected with the CIA?
That's actually another myth, that Air America's connection to the CIA was so secret at the time that they worked. Everyone likes to talk about who knew what, and I guess because that's kind of a sexy CIA topic. But the question of who knew what has recently been used to discredit employee claims for retirement credit, as if being able to identify the owner of your employer is what determines your status as an employee. I mean, employees making your coffee at Starbucks likely can't name the owner of Starbucks, but they're still Starbucks employees. Same thing at Burger King and to your local grocery store. Of course, I didn't know as a child that the U.S. government ownership was reflected on paper with CIA share certificates nominally issued to a few CIA employees. Nominally here meaning in name only. They didn't actually have owners' rights to sell the shares or will them to their children. And most Air America employees weren't told about these corporate paperwork details either, but on some level, we all knew there was a CIA connection. Back in those days, I guess nobody talked about it. We were like the opposite of today's social media, tell-all, share-all culture. But I knew from my dad's work travels and from who his friends were that he didn't work for a private airline. He was clearly involved in the war effort. One of his main social venues was the Military Officers Club, which was generally not open to private airline employees. But this was where he met with the people he needed to meet. And even as kids in Taipei, he often took us to an annex of the Officers Club for dinner on Sundays so he could communicate with various colleagues who were not Air Americans. Somehow, like all Air Americans, we absorbed the fact that we weren't supposed to ask a lot of questions.
You would just go to the Officers Club on Sunday afternoon and he would sit around and talk with the other CIA people?
Yes, and we'd go to the swimming pool.
And on top of that, I have to throw this in. You are a fluent speaker of Mandarin Chinese.
I am indeed.
I just had to throw that in. That didn't have too much to do with the Air America thing, but I was very impressed. Okay, now, all right. You sort of know what's going on as you were growing up and your father was working there. So you're saying this wasn't really all that secret?
Well, I'm sure many of our Vietnam vets out there had their suspicions about Air America back in the day. People used to refer to it as the worst kept secret in Washington. I have a book, or it's actually a magazine with a lengthy article featured on the cover. It's a magazine called Blue Book. It was the male counterpart of the women's magazine Red Book. And the article is entitled Air America, CIA's Secret Air Force, the USA's Deadliest Cold War Operation. And that magazine is from March of 1966. So back in the day, the secret wasn't all that secret. It was revealed in a magazine in your dentist's office. Also, the U.S. enemy in Laos, the Pathet Lao, used to blast radio broadcasts regularly about the U.S. imperialists continuing to use Air America as a disguised military organization. So for the U.S. government, including the CIA and Air America, the whole idea was not to talk about it. People were informed of matters only on a need-to-know basis, and the goal was really just plausible deniability. What people were told was one thing, and only certain people were actually told that Air America was synonymous with the U.S. government, and certainly only a few knew about the CIA share certificates. Really what people suspected, what people knew, what people claimed to know was neither here nor there, and certainly none of it had anything to do with anyone's employment status.
That is so amazing when you tell us these things. It's like, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And that looks like what they were doing there. That the government was trying to cover up something. And I remember in my unit, everybody in the unit was an expert. You know how it is. And they would say these things. And actually, nobody knew anything about it. We would always get excited when Air America helicopter would fly by. Talking about the CIA. Why did the CIA stick with the secrecy narrative for so long as Air Americans aged without retirement credit? Like, what happened? Couldn't they let bygones be bygones and let the people get their pensions?
You would think so, but the secret, one thing to know is the secret everyone knew for years was not officially declassified and released really until 2009. So what wasn't all that secret in Air America's day was played up dramatically since then, really in direct response to the employee claims for retirement credit. For example, in the court cases filed by Air Americans in the 1980s and 1990s, decisions against them were in part based on the dubious assertions that even the top executives of Air America didn't know about the CIA's ownership or connection. That was actually one of the findings in my dad's court case, that he, the vice president and legal counsel of various Air America corporate entities, didn't know who he worked for. This was, of course, ridiculous since his job revolved around hiding the government ownership and drafting those fake contracts that were used to cover up the relationship. and reporting on an almost daily basis to the CIA in Washington from Taipei. It's even more ludicrous that a federal judge would suggest that the Central Intelligence Agency would ever hire a lawyer who was that oblivious. At that point, they were just throwing up every hurdle they could. In reality, the CIA only hired guys like my dad who were already in the circle of trust, as I call it. In my dad's case, that was from working for years as an aviation lawyer in Washington, D.C., and who, for unavoidable reasons, had to be informed of the CIA purchase of Air America in 1950.
What happened to all these cases of Air Americans in federal court?
There were 3 or 4 cases that reached the top federal court, including my dad's, but they were all brought before the secret of U.S. government ownership was officially declassified. So that fact, which is, of course, at the heart of the claim for federal employee status, couldn't really be revealed or would not be considered by the courts. The courts clearly weren't going to go against the CIA, and I assume they were informed that secrecy required that the employees could not be allowed to win. So they came up with all sorts of rationales that are, of course, now destroyed by declassified documents. And in a further complication in the courts, which is just another hurdle along the way, Air Americans were harmed by another case that was brought by a different clandestine group in 1985 that resulted in a rift between the OPM, which is the federal government's personnel department, which was denying this group credit, and the Merit Systems Protection Board, which hears appeals of OPM denials. In this case, the Merit Systems Board sided with the employee group, and the OPM took the case to federal court. So while the case was pending, the OPM strategically changed its rules to say that federal employment status could only be proven by presentation of a government form. It's called an SF-52, Standard Form 52, which the employing agency needs to have filed on behalf of the employee. And this particular clandestine group didn't use those forms for its employees, and neither did Air America. The SF-52 wasn't required to prove federal status at the time either of those groups worked, and obviously would not have been used. They wouldn't have used a government form if the goal was to hide the U.S. government's involvement. But the court ruled in favor of OPM, effectively condoning the application of the new rule retroactively. So now the need to show an SF-52 became established as the law, and it was applied to Air Americans. So they were now required to produce a form 10 years after Air America shut down, and which clearly would never have been used in their situation. The only step left in the judicial process would be an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was unlikely to accept these kinds of cases. So the CIA and OPM thus closed off any hope of a judicial solution, which Air Americans were then left taking our David and Goliath struggle to Congress. It is worth noting that the other clandestine group did take their case to Congress, and legislation was passed granting them retirement credit. So there is hope.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I said, hey, I think there's hope. I'm going to stop the interview now and finish it up in the next episode. Whatever you do, don't miss it, because Maureen is going to tell us how this story turns out. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1832 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News, and make sure you listen to the next episode where Maureen is going to tell us the rest of the story. Thank you for listening.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?